NATO's no longer brain dead. Emmanuel Macron, who authored that quip back in 2019, can thank Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine for that. But now that it's back to its original mission of containing Moscow, can the alliance keep up? Kyiv has made it clear. You will do the fighting, you provide the weapons, but Ukraine lacks the ammunition and the air superiority needed for a quick kill and a counteroffensive that's up against greater Russian manpower and solid trenches. For Ukrainians, it's life or death. For NATO, is there the same war effort sense of urgency? We're talking about an organization founded 4 years after the end of World War II, when it quickly became clear that victorious allies were no longer allies, but nuclear-armed rivals. The likes of France and Germany have boosted defense spending by multiples unseen since the Cold War. But are Europeans and Americans ready for the long haul and an industrial-scale war effort over years? Deterrence that in a crisis could mean putting soldiers in harm's way. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, is NATO up to the challenge? And we're joined here in the studio by François Aisbourg, Senior Advisor to the International Institute for Strategic Studies think tank. Your latest book in French, Lessons of a War. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Well, pleased to welcome, she's normally in London, Auricia Lutsev. How do I pronounce it? Lutsevich, there we go. Deputy Director for Russia and the Eurasia Program at the think tank Chatham House. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
And from Cap Ferret, near the French city of Bordeaux, former U.S. ambassador to Finland, the newest member of NATO. Charles Adams, welcome to the show.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The hashtag is F24debate. You know, we're always warning journalists, François Aisbourg, not to oversell something. So when we're talking about the stakes of this NATO summit, how high are they really?
My own feeling until a few days ago was that expectations were being raised too high. Because in effect, the summit was not going to decide on a timetable for eventual Ukrainian membership of NATO, and it was basically going to approve formally plans which had already been approved, the defense plans for NATO's new defense policy as they have been churned out by the NATO command structure. But I'm revising that judgment because more has happened than we had bargained for. First of all, the Turkish president said yes to Sweden's accession to NATO. He had previously indicated that he was in favor of Ukraine joining NATO, which got less notice, but is not a trivial consideration either. And we have President Zelensky physically present in Vilnius, who has been complaining about the rather limp language which has been used at the summit about Ukraine's path to NATO, which is essentially, we'll tell you what it is when we will have agreed about what it is.
Yeah, because there's still disagreement.
No, the paradox is not
between NATO members.
No, the paradox is not that there's still disagreement. The paradox is that whereas a few months ago, I think nobody was expecting this topic of NATO membership for Ukraine to become an actionable item so quickly. A number of countries like France or Italy had not had a serious debate yet. Germany was dead set against. The Bush administration was talking about the so-called Israeli model.
The Biden administration.
Yeah, the Biden administration, the U.S. administration. And what has happened over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and it's now sort of coming together, is that, well, first of all, countries like France and most other Western European countries are now in favor of Ukraine joining NATO, are saying so explicitly. That is new. The Biden administration has, in effect, signaled that Ukraine could eventually be put on a fast track by removing what is called the requirement for a membership action plan as a first stage in the accession process to NATO. The membership action plan is more or less supposed to qualify a country militarily for membership as well as politically.
All right, so that's a delay. And Charles Adams, we had the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dalder, on this set 24 hours ago, and he was saying, the reason why the U.S. is putting the brakes on this plan is they don't want to find themselves in direct confrontation with Russia. In direct confrontation between two nuclear superpowers. Is that the right course? Is the Biden administration right to proceed with caution?
I think the Biden administration is reflecting a certain amount of prudence in the speed with which it responds to what is a growing consensus on the question of the invitation to Ukraine. I agree entirely with the analysis of Mr. Ezbour. This summit has, I think, exceeded what already were high expectations. The fact that the Americans are unwilling at this point to announce explicitly support for an imminent invitation to Ukraine, I think is natural. It's responding to caution and to a sense of proportion. The Americans and the Germans are lagging in that sense.
We're losing half of the words.
Sorry, we're having a bit of issues with the audio. We'll get those sorted out in a second. Before landing in Vilnius, Ukraine's president vented over Twitter over the likes of Biden, stating that Ukraine had yet to meet conditions for joining the club. He stated that a window of opportunity is being left to bargain Ukraine's membership in NATO in negotiations with Russia. And for Russia, this means motivation to continue its terror. Uncertainty is weakness. He sent off that tweet, Ariza Lutsevich, and then he landed in Lithuania to a rock star welcome with a huge rally in Vilnius. Of course, is this a little bit crocodile tears? I mean, he wasn't expecting anything other, was he?
Well, Zelensky is off-putting a lot of heads of states from the very beginning of this war. It started all from the fact that he actually decided to stay in Ukraine and defend the country together with his countrymen, and in his communications throughout these 403 days of war, directly actually speaking truth about the brutality of this invasion and calling a spade, and calling for action, for united action of NATO, of its allies, and also of more than 50 countries that are actually part of the Rammstein global coalition to help Ukraine arm. Zelensky is right. The stakes are very high. And I think what Ukrainians expect from this summit is a clear message where Ukraine belongs strategically and security-wise. Obviously, nobody is expecting Ukraine to become a NATO member tomorrow. Pathway to membership is what Ukrainian leadership and Ukrainian people demand. And that pathway will take time. It will take time to reform Ukraine from within and also to still build compatibility between Ukrainian armed forces and NATO armed forces. But I think Zelensky wants to bring back home something that will also boost morale for Ukrainian armed forces on the battlefield that are fighting a fierce battle that no NATO general will actually send its troops to fight across the minefields, trenches, defenses, and very complicated situations.
Okay, but Ariza, let's see if we can boost, if the morale will be boosted by some of the other announcements that have come out of day one of this summit. First, it was France's president with a big announcement, Paris announcing that it already started shipping Scalp Franco-British long-range missiles, aka Storm Shadows. They're produced with the UK, which is already starting to deliver them.
Given the situation and the counteroffensive being conducted by Ukraine, I've decided to increase deliveries of arms and equipment and to provide the Ukrainians with deep strike capabilities.
Arizia Lutsevchik, then there was the announcement that 11 NATO members are going to be training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s in Denmark and Romania starting next month. How big are these announcements?
It's very important. This is very important both for the current campaign, but it's more important for the future durability of peace, because Ukraine, together with its allies, must be able to protect the territory of Ukraine, the sovereign territory of Ukraine, and it must be prepared to use these capabilities, the air defense, the modern air defense that is compatible with NATO. Obviously, Ukraine at this point is steadily building its capacity, and if you look even at the provision of tanks, for example, from Western partners, Russia actually lost half of its stock of tanks, while Ukraine has now replenished half of its stock of tanks, and they are more modern, they are better performing on the battlefield, and this is where this war is clear, that Putin cannot win it militarily. It's just a question of time when Ukraine will be able to squeeze out Russia from its territory. And those capabilities, especially long-range missiles, are critical because they can do deep strikes into logistics, munition units, and undermine Russia's capacity to entrench inside Ukraine's territory.
Do you share that optimism, François Hesbourg?
I'm a bit more cautious. I think what foreign observers and friends of Ukraine note is that the counteroffensive is very difficult. And this does not come as a surprise, because Ukraine is in effect supposed to do without a proper air force what in a NATO plan would normally be done by a combined ground and air force effort. And Ukraine is struggling to pierce, to break through the prepared Russian positions. The offensive against a prepared adversary is usually bloodier than the defense.
Because we had been sold since the early 90s this idea that you do shock and awe. You take out the command structures and then what we've seen with this war is that's not at all what's happened.
Sorry, shock and awe was about dealing with countries like Iraq.
Yeah.
Russia is not like Iraq, and Ukraine is not like Kuwait. The only comparable doctrine would actually be the old NATO doctrines, the ones which were elaborated against the Soviet Union and which have now been updated. And this is the other big decision in Vilnius, which many observers don't consider as particularly important. They happen to be wrong. That is the fact that NATO has gotten back into serious defense planning. That is, where each NATO country knows in advance where in a given contingency its soldiers, its aircraft, its tanks would be operating. This is something which we had stopped doing from the early 90s until after 2014, the invasion of Crimea and of the Donbass. And that is a war which Ukraine is not today in a position to fight because of the lack of air support, of combat aircraft. So the paradox here is that those countries which are supporting Ukraine are afraid that the offensive may not work as well or as quickly as was hoped, and that therefore we actually have to increase our efforts. And that was the signal from Macron about the scalps. The notion that we were going to deliver the scalps had been floating around for some time. After all, it is a joint British-French weapon, and the British could not send them without the French approving. So there was no basic obstacle in principle. But the fact that we're doing it now does tell us something about the fears that we have as to Ukraine's ability to break through.
Charles Adams, your thoughts on that? Having served again in a country that's historically always, even though it was neutral, wary of Russia's might, and now sitting in one where we've seen a change in how the leadership views this war.
Very much so. The Finnish population prior to February 24 of last year was to the extent of 75% against Finnish membership in NATO. And within a matter of days, a consensus emerged in the Finnish population in favor of membership in NATO in the quickest possible time. One observation can be made regarding the counteroffensive in Ukraine at the moment is that because of the lack of air superiority, this is indeed not, as Wu had just said, a combined arms operation. As a result, the Ukrainians have found it more effective to be operating in small groups. And I was struck by a comment by a Ukrainian commander, about which I read, comparing the current tactic of the Ukrainians, counteroffensive, to the Finns in the Winter War against the Soviets in 1939 and 40. And indeed, is what one is observing on the battlefield in Ukraine at the moment. And it is slow, but it is going to be effective. And it is going to be increasingly effective in the weeks to come as the Ukrainians bring to bear those units which are equipped with advanced weapons from the West, from NATO, and the best of the training which has been imparted.
Which they're going to get. Okay, that's the glass half full. The glass half empty is that the Ukrainians are running low on ammunition, hence the United States saying that they're going to send cluster munitions as a stopgap measure. Ukrainians also contending with an enemy that's, well, adapting to new drone technology with signal jamming and drones of their own, like near the flashpoint city of Bakhmut.
Підняв дрон.
Raise the drone, find the target, transmit the coordinates to the artillery. The artillery is working and our infantry is moving forward. It's much easier that way. We often lose drones because enemy electronic warfare and anti-drone guns are working.
Yeah, he's talking there about EW, which is a term that suddenly has popped up. It's kind of like in previous big conflicts where one side has a technological advantage and the other side matches it, and they seem to neutralize one another. This could go on for years.
It's a race. This war is the race for technology. I mean, I don't think we've seen this kind of large scale of drone use both in open field but also urban warfare. We do see Russians launching non-stop these attacks by cheap pre-produced drones from Iranian technology. Now they are warming up production inside Russia, and this is where we, as an Ukraine and an alliance, NATO alliance, has to think really seriously about what kind of capabilities we must produce in order to prepare for future high-intensity conflict of this kind of technological complexity. Ukraine has been building its army of drones. Zelensky was fundraising through his United 24 to raise quite a lot of funds, and they did build quite a significant compound of drones. I think roughly 700 plus. There has been around 500 provided by Western assistance to Ukraine, including, you know, some of the US, some British, some French drones as well. So Ukraine is capable, of course, to deploy quite a lot of digital warfare. But what we've heard from the report, after they identify the target, then they lack munitions. They lack very often 100 155 for the artillery to actually target those reconnaissance targets that drones are able to identify on the battlefield.
Let's go to Vilnius now, and our correspondent Terry Schultz, who's following the summit. Terry, at dinner conversation, what tops the agenda? Is it air superiority or is it ammo?
Actually, I would guess that it's President Zelensky's displeasure with this statement that has come out of the NATO summit so far, the communique, which does not give him a time frame for joining the alliance. In fact, it may not shorten the process at all by saying that there are still conditions attached to the invitation to join NATO and saying that all allies need to agree. It's clear that they're nowhere near that position yet.
And Terry, the star of the show, Volodymyr Zelensky, perhaps the other star of the show, is Turkey's president with that 11th hour about face, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who was all smiles in the handshake he had with Joe Biden in a side meeting after approving Sweden's bid to join the alliance.
That's certainly true that he got out of being the villain of the summit by giving the agreement to Sweden last night after heavy pressure from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, other allies, including, of course, the United States. This issue was hanging over the beginning of the summit on the eve before it began. But, you know, with Erdogan agreeing to Swedish membership, it sort of cleared the way for them to really focus on Ukraine after that. We should say, though, that, you know, Sweden isn't completely in the clear yet because the Turkish parliament hasn't voted, and something that's often overlooked is that the Hungarian parliament has also not voted yet. Hungary had said it would not be the last one to approve Sweden, so I would imagine they're hurrying up now ahead of whenever the Turkish parliament is going to vote, which should be in the not too distant future.
And golly, Terry, there's a little bit of a coincidence. Washington unblocking Ankara's request to buy $20 billion worth of new F-16 fighter jets, as well as modernizing existing warplanes.
No coincidence. This was always linked, even though both the United States and Turkey denied it. In fact, as late as the day before the agreement, when President Biden called President Erdogan, the sort of readout of their conversation was that F-16s were discussed, Swedish membership was discussed, there's no connection between the two. Everybody knew they were connected.
How momentous, I know you've covered your share of NATO summits, how momentous is this one?
You know, it depends on who you ask, really. To get Sweden in the alliance, to have Finland here as the latest member of the alliance, those are big deals. NATO now has a completely unbroken front, you know, from Sweden all the way down, Sweden to Finland, all the way down the eastern flank there, and that's a big deal. There are no gaps anymore, and you know, even 2-3 years ago, we never could have imagined that all of these countries would be members of NATO. At the same time, I think it's going to be momentous for Ukraine and its disappointment. President Zelensky very much feels that his country is taking the heat for NATO, that NATO citizens are safe because Ukrainian citizens are dying on the front line, and he very much would have liked to see recognition of that at this summit, that Ukraine would no longer be left outside the alliance once the war is over. And while all allies do agree you can't invite Ukraine in while the war is underway, they don't agree that the hand will be extended as soon as it's not.
Terry Schultz, many thanks for that live update from the NATO summit in Vilnius. Arisia Lutsevich, when all is said and done, how will Ukrainians look back at these 2 days, you think?
I think Ukrainians are not giving up. This is what we've seen from day one. Ukrainians don't take no as an answer. This is just one of the milestones, and I think it's important milestone for actually bridging some of these misunderstandings. I still think what Ukraine can contribute to NATO, because it's not just a recipient or Ukraine could be a donor to actually European security. And why? You know, Francois talked talked about this new force posture. NATO is rethinking how it can actually face Russia as an adversary. What better combat-prepared army there will be in Europe, with a lot of really skilled men and women who know on the battlefield what it means to fight a modern warfare, with integrating all kind of NATO technology. Let's take Ukraine Digital Delta program that is feeding into one portal the intelligence from the battlefield, from the drones, from the back headquarters, and it actually was tested to be compatible with F-16's operational system. That tells you something, that even at times of war, with partial assistance from NATO member states, Ukraine is able to prove its efficacy. And also think about that. Overall, NATO member states donated less than 0.2% of their GDP in military assistance. And with that investment, Ukraine destroyed half of Russian military capabilities. Isn't that a good investment in European security?
Sunday's decision by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, by the way, to allow Volodymyr Zelensky to return to Kyiv with 5 commanders of the siege of Mariupol's Azov Brigade. That kind of set the tone. These were men who, under the terms of a prisoner swap with Russia last year, were supposed to stay in Turkey until the end of the conflict. The Kremlin putting a brave face on all this after Erdogan's green light to Sweden.
Turkey's a member of the North Atlantic Alliance. Turkey has its obligations. Turkey's committed to its obligations. It's never been a secret to us. And in this regard, we never wore rose-tinted glasses. This is how we feel about it. We understand everything very well in this regard.
Okay, François Hesbois. We know that sooner or later there would have been some negotiation, and certainly, as Terry Schultz was saying, the F-16s certainly sweetened the deal that the Americans gave the Turks, perhaps. Sweden's NATO bid approved by Turkey. But why send back those 5 commanders from the Azov Brigade with Zelensky? Was that not a direct message to Moscow by Erdogan?
Yeah, it's 2 things here. First, the F-16s, it has to go through Congress. And the U.S. Congress is not a highly predictable decision-making body, so that the Turks are not there yet as far as the F-16s are concerned. Now, why Erdogan slapped Putin in his face?
Slapped him in the face?
Well, yeah. I mean, this was a prisoner exchange at a high level, and the Turkish president decided that he was not going to abide by the terms. That's very personal. And it was immediately after the meeting between Zelensky and Erdogan in Istanbul. So the message for Putin must have been very severe. Why Erdogan had chosen to do this, I simply do not know. If I were Putin, I would be worried, because it reinforces the notion that he is a loser. You know, we had the Prigozhin mutiny. He is accused of treason and so on. And then we learned yesterday that Prigozhin and 34 of his henchmen had been received by Putin.
But isn't that the way Vladimir Putin operates? He'll bring you back in for a while, and
if you make a television call saying that you have to punish the traitors, and then you decide that, well, he's not a traitor after all, it's sort of difficult to explain, even in Russia, because after all, this was on Russian television, and it was not exactly done behind the curtains. This is obviously not a happy moment for Putin, particularly, and I come back to this question of Ukraine's membership in NATO. Zelensky is rightly professing to be unhappy with the current state of NATO's declaration concerning Ukraine's accession. But the fact is that the whole nature of the debate is now about Ukraine joining NATO. This was not the case 2 or 3 months ago. This is new. And the 2 big holdouts are not the ones you'd normally expect. the French with their complicated relationship with NATO, or the Turks, bloody-minded, always wanting to have something in exchange or whatnot. No, the two holdouts are the US and Germany. Most of the other countries are now reconciled with the notion that there should be a roadmap for accession for Ukraine, and notably the case of France. That's a big deal. And the United States is already shifting gears. We saw that with the membership action plan being no longer a requirement. That really speeds up the whole process. And that's half of the time needed to become a NATO member, which is simply taken off the table. And then you have the Germans, and the Germans, as usual, will eventually tag along because the price for not doing so will become politically prohibitive.
Charles Adams, you heard there what François Hesbourg said, that what Recep Tayyip Erdogan did, not so much with allowing Sweden in, but giving those 5 members of the Azov Brigade to Zelensky to go back home with him last Sunday, that was defying the Kremlin. Why is it that the likes, to pick up on what he just said, the likes of Turkey are defying in this way, whereas, again, we get back to the original question, the U.S. is playing it more cautious?
I was absolutely by Mr. Erdogan in the return of right.
Charles, I'm sorry I'm going to have to interrupt you because we're still having trouble with the audio connection there with Cap Ferret. Apologies for that. We'll try to reconnect as quickly as possible. That will persist, as Ariza was saying earlier. Your thoughts on this? What happened between Erdogan and Putin?
You know, let's remember where one of the theaters of this war is taking place. It's the Black Sea. It's something we forget in the continental Europe. Here in France, people think Mediterranean, in the north, Baltic Sea. But Black Sea is at the heart of this war. This is where Russia started by trying to mount the occupation of Snake Island as an important island. And this is the island Zelensky visited right before coming to NATO. He wants to show that you can be brave, you can deny Russian dominance in the Black Sea. This is, I think, what he was talking about with Erdogan. And I think also, let's note that the grain deal is expiring, and the world depends on Ukrainian grain, depends on Ukrainian cereal. And we should we stay, step aside and allow Russia to continue Black Sea blockade, basically, while watching the world being hungry? No. And this is where there was a conversation about the possibility of Turkish Navy actually accompanying Ukrainian grain tankers to deliver food to Africa and other places in sub-Saharan Africa especially.
So you think there's a deal in the works?
Turkey now after elections is ready to be more assertive, and I think this is something also for NATO to discuss overall, what will be the strategy in the Black Sea.
But can Erdogan afford that? After all, there's the imports of Russian gas. There's a new deal on a nuclear power plant with Russia. There's terrorists who come in.
Putin is now in a weak position. Putin is losing this war. Putin is not winning on any front. His plans from plan A to capture Kiev, to plan B to capture Odessa, is failing. And this is where there could be a turning point in this war, where countries like Turkey will play a much different game.
Yeah, what Orissia just said is very important. If Turkey does decide to use its navy, to field its navy, to serve as escorts for the grain ships, that is not only tremendously important at the global level, because it's about feeding the world, but it also means that if the Russians attack those Turkish ships, then we get into a NATO problem. Article 5 would probably be invoked by Turkey, and it would be very difficult to deny it to Turkey under those conditions. So if people are worried about escalation, this is actually one of the highest risk situations since the beginning of the war. So I don't know whether it's going to happen, but as you put it earlier on, the Turks are being currently less prudent than the Americans.
For reasons that are not quite clear, then there's the other prospect, and again, we're talking about a nuclear power, and that's the prospect of humiliation. And Vladimir Putin channeled the fact that Russians felt humiliated in the 1990s. Are we headed towards a new humiliation of Russia?
Well, I think this is the conversations Russians should have at home about why they feel humiliated. They have been welcomed from Cannes to the city of London with the red carpet, being able to trade, to do deals, to actually be welcomed in the global community. Russian gas was flowing to Germany. And I think Putin defined humiliation in very imperial terms. He defined humiliation for Russian nation as something that he is entitled to the sphere of influence, to the sphere of control, and he's entitled to restore Soviet Union, and Ukraine is not entitled to be the nation. If this is the kind of humiliation, then I think Ukraine and its allies should work towards actually defeating that ideology that has been put in place by Putin. And honestly, I think the fact that we should be afraid of escalation, well, just example of Sweden and Finland joining NATO shows you that Russians' level of capacity to escalate is very low.
All right, let's talk about this, because historians here in the West are divided over how to handle Russia based on the past track record. The quote is, "We prevailed and they didn't." It's attributed in 1990 to then U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush in a conversation with then German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. 1990, the year Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev was welcomed at a NATO summit here in Paris. Just a year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Gorbachev, who envisioned a brighter future for all.
By constantly cooperating in all affairs related to shaping a new type of world politics, to moving towards the new peaceful period of history, we will fulfill our duty to other nations as well.
And the criticism made of the West then, François Hesbourg, was that the West was proposing, the Soviets were in good faith proposing a new world order, and the West was saying, we won and you lost.
Well, they lost. They lost so enormously that the empire disappeared. And it didn't disappear because the West wanted it to disappear. And indeed, the same George W. Bush spent most of the summer of 1991 desperately trying to convince the Ukrainians not to go independent. We liked the stability provided by the existence of the USSR. So let's not talk ourselves into making our history look bad when it actually was quite good. On humiliation, I agree with what Orysia said, but there's another brand of humiliation, and that's the sort which Putin was subjected to by Erdogan with the 5 prisoners. It's not about empire. It's about direct personal humiliation. That's very severe. But what is Putin going to do about it? What are the consequences? He's not going to nuke Ankara or Istanbul. That would be, suicidally stupid and incompetent. And Putin has many faults, but he's not. I don't think he has a suicidal bent in him. It may help lead the Russians to the negotiating table, under conditions which should be as good as possible, that is, a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive so that we can talk in a position of force vis-à-vis the Russians. But that sort of humiliation, he can't really brush away that easily, because it's not Russia which was humiliated with the prisoner thing. It was Putin as such, in the same way that Prigozhin humiliated Putin. The power of Putin, and Antony Blinken used the expression, is being cracked. There are cracks in the vertical of power, to use the expression which Putin uses himself to describe the nature of his power.
But there's a lot of people inside the Pentagon that are worried, because if Putin is replaced by a Prigozhin, for them, that's something even more volatile and unpredictable.
I think this is something we make a mistake. Putin is Prigozhin. Prigozhin is Putin. He is the creature of current Russian regime. Putin went himself on the record saying how much he was paid. He is part of the Russian military intelligence unit. He is working under the command and in cooperation with Russian Ministry of Defense. It is part of the system we are dealing, and that system is actually sponsoring this kind of criminal, mercenary, terrorist-type groups that are operating in Africa, that are undermining consolidation of democracies, that are extracting resources, that are finding ways to bypass sanctions. So let's not be afraid of defeating Russia, because this fear, actually, of instability causes stable war in Europe, and we want to avoid that.
You write in the conclusion to your report that ensuring that the experience of the war and its results lead Russia to change its foreign and security policy, become less aggressive and self-entitled. But are you really expecting that at the end of all of this, if it finishes the way you've predicted with a Russian loss, that Russians will turn around and recognize the error of their ways?
Well, the report you mentioned does not prophesy that it will finish like that. This report says what are the steps that we must do in order to have a stability, not just in Ukraine, but in wider Europe. Let's remember, this is not about territory in Donbass, in Crimea, in Ukraine. So I do believe that if current Russian Putin's doctrine fails, there will be elites in Russia that will reconsider whether this pays off. And also, if NATO will take all the precautions that are needed on the eastern flank, when Ukraine will be firmly integrated in the alliance, Russia simply will be denied an opportunity and will go through a certain internal process of transformation. But this is the only way this can happen. We have to actually help Russians to go through the de-imperialization and thinking of what it is to be a normal nation state.
After the experience, again, of the fall of the Berlin Wall and all the chaos that ensued in the 1990s, François Hesbourg, what lessons would there be for the West in this process that's described here by Risa?
The lesson is, for the West, quite simple, and that is recreating the Soviet Union would probably not be a great idea. And it should not be allowed to happen. If Russia wins the war against Ukraine, and it could still happen, I don't share the basic...
What do you define as a win? Because does it mean taking over all of Ukraine, or does it mean reducing the Donbass to rubble?
At this stage, it's about changing the governance in Kiev. It's about subjecting what is left of Ukraine, because, of course, as you know, the Russians purport to have annexed 4 regions plus Crimea into Russia, and the Russian constitution says that they're now part of Russia. So it's a divided Ukraine with a subject protégé government. That is the definition for Ukraine and the West losing the war, and it's the definition for Russia of winning the war. It could still happen. That's a lesson for the West. The lesson for Russia is more complicated, because Risa is absolutely right. This is about empire. Ukraine, without, I think it was Big Brzezinski who used to say, without Ukraine, Russia cannot recreate an empire. And with Ukraine, Russia necessarily becomes once again an empire, like the Soviet Union or like the Tsarist Empire, with all of the consequences that we know. This is what we are aiming to prevent. But the Russians also note that moving away from empire is a very fraught process. The French, for example, when we decided to drop empire in 1960-61 under General de Gaulle, well, our problem was not that people liked getting rid of empire. The problem is that the holdovers of empire nearly killed General de Gaulle, mounted a military coup. There was a real risk of chaos. That was not a reason not to do it. De Gaulle was right. to try to stop empire. And we should not negotiate or act against our own interests. Our interest is for Ukraine to win the war, that is, reestablish its territorial integrity, its full sovereignty, blah, 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 all of that. And our interest is that Russia should not achieve its own war aims. If you lose sight of that particular ball, then you're going to start working against your own interest. Oh, is this Russian better or worse than that Russian? That's not... I don't think the West should actually be thinking about regime change. I don't think the objective of the West is to provoke regime change in Moscow. And if regime change is messy, or if it isn't messy, well, that's a consequence, but it's not one which we should be actually considered as being responsible for. We should not make ourselves responsible for what the Russians do to themselves.
But this is why, to loop it back all the way to NATO, if Russia is in a NATO strategic compass identifies the most immediate threat to NATO, not to Ukraine, then it means that jointly with Ukraine, we must ensure that Russian military capabilities to attack both Ukraine, neighbors, Moldova, Georgia, other countries, this is not just about Ukraine, and also to continue hybrid, vicious disinformation, cyber, and other chemical attacks on the territory of NATO member states should be prevented. This is what it is about, is to decimating Russian capabilities to pursue aggressive military and foreign policy.
And is there a chance it could wind up in between? That is to say, you have some kind of a situation where, I don't know, the Donbass becomes like North Korea, this place that's contested and sealed off.
Only if American troops will be on Ukrainian territory. Will they be on Ukrainian territory? I don't think Joe Biden will approve that. That's why I don't believe the North and South Korea analogy here is actually relevant.
It doesn't work. I agree.
All right, I want to thank you. There's so much more to talk about, and it's only day one of this summit. Arizia Lutsevich, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well François Hesbourg. Apologies to Charles Adams. The Skype gods were not with us this Tuesday, but we'll try it again very soon. Thank you for being with us here. More coverage on our website, France24.com.